So I'm John Gaventa. I'm a fellow here at IDS, but I'm also chairing this in my recent capacity as the executive editor of the IDS Bulletin. 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago, in 1995, the IDS Bulletin did its first issue on linking development and democracy, on democratic governance. It was edited at the time by Mark Robinson, who was a fellow here then, had important articles by Mick, Gordon White, a fellow who's now deceased, Tom Carruthers with the Carnegie Institute, Anne-Marie Gertz, and many other illustrious names in this area. It came at a time in 1990s when democracy was on the rise, and the Bulletin really focused on how to consolidate democracy and how to link democracy to development. The hopes were high, and the agenda being named at that time on linking good governance and civil society, as we know, has been supported widely in development circles for the last 30 years. However, there was also an important essay in the Bulletin by Gordon White, who was a great thinker at the time on civil society. He warned, I think prophetically, he warned to the extent that the dual goals of democratization and development cannot be achieved in tandem, then societies face the future danger of a mutually reinforcing downward spiral of economic and political decline. He put his finger on it, didn't he, 30 years ago, mutually reinforcing downward decline of economic and political decline. So now we're at a very different point in our political history, with democratic decline growing economic inequality, rising authoritarianism. So that's why we thought it would be a good time to revisit the questions from 30 years ago, asking what's different about today and what are the prospects of a democratic governance agenda in the future. And so to do that bulletin, Shandana and Marioka, who will lead off, have agreed to edit it. The bulletin will include some contributions from past contributors like Mick, Mark, Tom Carruthers, and Marie Gertz. But also, as the bulletin's very different these days, it also will welcome and include contributions from other thinkers from the South, from our partners. And so we're delighted to have other people here represented today. So the flow of order is Shandana, who's the governance cluster leader, as you know, will kick off, and followed by Marioka. Marioka is the cluster leader of the Power and Popular Politics group. Both have been doing a lot of work on democracy. Then we're delighted to welcome Hamid Khalifallah. Hamid has worked as a practitioner and activist for many years. He's currently doing his PhD at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, researching democratic transition and grassroots movements in Africa, especially in Sudan. And we also will then hear from Yamini Ayad. Yamini, welcome. Yamini has written widely on governance and democracy. In the past, served as the president and chief executive of the Center for Policy Research in India, and now is based at Brown University. And then finally, we'll ask Mick Moore, as you know, a senior fellow at IDS, to give some of his contributions. I've asked you to try to keep it relatively brief, 5 to 6 minutes, to allow time for discussion. And you about, in addition to what they said, what themes do you think are important in terms of these questions, or what's different between then and now, and where are the hopes for and prospects for democratic governance in the future? With that, I'll hand over to Donna.
Thank you, John. So as John said, we're just at the start of thinking about what should be in this bulletin, but we have had all of our contributors write to us with really interesting abstracts, a very quick idea of what it is they want to write about. So it's now to me and Marioka to figure out what holds all of that together. What are the ideas that will now hold that together? So we're crowdsourcing a little bit here of what do you hear today? What strikes you as where we're at with democracy? Some of us study it in a lot of detail, others live it on a daily basis. We work within those contexts everywhere. So we all have quite strong ideas about where we're at with regards to democracy. So this is very much a sort of open session. We will speak very quickly and then really want all of you to speak to it. So when we first sat down to this and started inviting contributions, Marioke, John, and I thought that there's essentially 4 debates here. I'll speak to the first 3 and I'll hand over to Marioke for the final one. And maybe that's what we're going to talk about. But as I speak through this, you'll see that maybe the first 2 are things we don't really need to speak to anymore, especially given a lot of our abstracts that we've got. And maybe our introduction article for sure, and the bulletin sits on around points 3 and 4. So the first one was whether we want to pick up the debate. One of the big debates right now is we all talk about democratic backsliding, but there's a big debate out there on whether there is democratic backsliding or not. So in 2023, a special issue of Political Science and Politics by Little and Ming, they organized this because they wanted to push the idea that there really isn't, and that we're overreacting to some things that have happened. And they based most of that the push against it on the sorts of indicators that we're using, and said if you really just stick with the objective indicators of democracy, you'll see that we're actually advancing on a lot of those. In the same issue, they then also invited others who didn't agree with that, who said it isn't just about the objective indicators, because democracy is about so much more than that. And it's about interactions and contestation, and a lot of the things that our Birmingham colleagues talked about yesterday about the politics of development. And so a lot of those things within democracy essentially mean that it's beyond objective indicators. So that debate is raging. And that question is before us of whether we want to speak to that or not. No one has really written an abstract that wants to speak to that. So I have a feeling that that's going to, maybe we don't take that up in this bulletin. The second one, and led by a quite fantastic article by Tom Carruthers recently in the Journal of Democracy, is whether there's a relationship between democracy and development. So his article says there isn't. There never really has been one. I think Mick may speak to a little bit of that in his comments later on as well. But for anyone who takes democracy and public policy here as a module at IDS will hear me say quite a lot on the literature that says that there is a link, that there has been a link, that Leftwich and all, Jaworski and all have written for a while about the fact that it's not a very strong link, but lives under democracy are less miserable, to use their exact words. And in this issue, Anne-Marie Gertz and Rob Jenkins are also suggesting that they want to break down that concept of what is democracy and which aspects of it might be related to development. And so they think that it has the ability in Indonesia, for example, to push through for peace, but maybe not on things like accountability. And accountability is what we need to draw that relationship with democracy, with development, with pushing through development. So I think that's sort of in there. But the really big area, and my final point here, the one that I'm really interested in thinking about more, is whether we want to talk about the fact that what's really happening here is the changing nature of class alignments and gender politics that inform the politics of political parties and how citizens draw links to political parties, why voters support the parties that they do, and that the traditional lines that divided them have now shifted. And the way we think about class politics, the way we used to think about left and right politics has shifted. And what now defines the support base of different parties is now what we need to think about. There was a time when we thought that the lines were really muted. People complained about the fact that parties sat too close to each other and we couldn't really tell the difference between them. We're in a different time now. The line is very clear between parties in many parts of the world, but those lines are not what we expect them to be. So there's a whole class and gender politics to the way voters are working that we really need to talk about. And this is actually the thing that's come out in a lot of the abstracts we've received. So clearly, this is an area that people want to speak to a lot more. And so I will stop with that. And this leads very nicely, actually, into the next point that Marioke is going to pick on. And then please come back to us on these points after.
Thanks, Chandana. So the final point that we want to speak to in the bulletin, and some scholars will do, is about the new dynamics of contention, because there we've known a lot about the factors and the actors driving the democratic the backsliding and backlash. We've emphasized we need to do more of understanding the societal dynamics that drive the backlash, like Sundana has just pointed out, not just the big bad state actors, but the societal groups that support these autocratic leaders and populist movements, why they do so, what is so appealing about them, why buy into a polarizing rhetoric, how does social media play a role on this? And there's also blurring lines between right-wing populist parties and their movements. Some of the movement theory is now showing how the repertoires of action adopted by right-wing parties are very similar to the pro-democratic parties that we've all conventionally studied. I've always been particularly interested in the youth dimension of this, as young people do not just play a role in the countering and the protest, but also within these backlash actors. So there's contention in society around that very, very clearly. We've started a new project recently called Youth Effective Polarization and Trust with Shandana and I and other colleagues involved, where we're looking at this in Brazil, South Africa, and India, and young members of these communities in London. So addressing the transnational dimension of how they engage with politics in the countries of their family origin, and very strongly also the element of social media, which was obviously not prominent in the IDS Bulletin issue 35 years ago. I've worked previously on everyday authoritarianism, and now have an article on ZANU-PF youth in Zimbabwe with Simbarashe Gukurume, which shows that some people are really driven also to join this autocratic ruling party to help their communities and see the vehicle to do so in the ruling party. They're not just the opportunistic youth, which is the conventional idea, but they were really also driven by values, but the ZANU-PF values. However, even if they do this politely and not violently, they reproduce the authoritarian system from below. And you don't need that many of them to actually sustain these systems, so even if they're in a minority. At the same time, we're seeing contention by diverse actors challenging these autocratic parties and the autocrats in society, basically. And there's reason to be still hopeful about this being important also in the years to come. And again, young people play an important role in this. Just look at the Gen Z protests in Kenya, which were really claimed by youth in a protest identity. And I'd like to mention an article by Zoe Marks that was published recently in the summer on African popular protest and political change, which showed that the non-violent protest movements have been far more successful than civil war insurgent type of action in driving political change, in taking down the bad democratic governments as well as the autocratic governments. And that she points at two factors driving the success of these non-violent movements, that they're inclusive in terms of integrating women and young people, and that they got quite, the persistent movements are able to manage to get the security actors to defect, which is possibly more typical for the African continent. So understanding where and how this works in the different places, and Hamid today will speak to this, is on the agenda for the future. But coming back to Shandana's point about the voters, these informal politics matter very much, especially for younger generations, but still interact with electoral politics in many parts of the world. Just think about diverse places like Senegal, like Poland, like Brazil, where these protest movements spiraled into electoral politics, and the first time younger voters really made a difference in the electoral turnout and what happened after. So there's reasons to be hopeful. And I'll leave it there. Moving online.
Great, thanks. And I think that that's a great setup, and nice to hear about reasons to be hopeful. But I think your comments about youth and other things take us straight on to Hamid. So Hamid Kalafala, as I mentioned, is doing his PhD in Birmingham. And I think you'll hear in our presentations today a real difference where we have case studies and we have big overviews. And that's what the bulletin will also have. And We think both are very, very important. Hamid, over to you, and if you could just take 5 or 6 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and good afternoon, everyone. Very pleased to be speaking to you today. So yes, for the bulletin, I will be working with another colleague, Olo Ojuwali, and also with great support from Marioka on the piece around youth protest and democratic trajectories in Africa, but focusing on 3 cases: Nigeria, Senegal, and Sudan. And basically, where the paper starts from, the point of departure is the opportunities and the challenges that are present for democratic governance in the continent, particularly in the context of the large young populations, as a trend in many African countries, or most African countries rather, and what kind of that means for democratic governance, and basically looking at pro-democracy mobilization by these young populations in these different case studies, and what different dynamics that brings on board. And basically, to speak about the Sudan case study, initially, I think, so with the war that started in Sudan in April last year and so on, a lot of people became quite worry of the mobilization of young people in Sudan and the revolution that they led in 2018, 2019, and the democratic transition that followed it, and how that all ended now in a war and so on. And that kind of raised a lot of questions about what extent is the mobilization of young people in this context useful and effective, and what is the impact basically. However, I think what I will try to suggest is that we need to see the current war in Sudan as a counter-revolutionary war, and there are so many reasons for why this the war could be framed in that sense, as a counter-revolutionary war, where the mobilization of young people and youth in the country for democracy was very strong, that actors who had different interests, including the military and regional actors and so on, had to launch a fully blown war to kind of impede the mobilization that was being led by young people for democracy and so on. And like I said, there are so many reasons for why this framing could hold and would make sense in that essence. And then from there, I would look into how the impact of the mobilization of these young grassroots pro-democracy groups led by young people and so on throughout the past 5 years since the revolution in 2018, 2019, and what impact do we still see in the Sudanese society and community beyond the failure, quote unquote, of the political transition and the current context and so on. And there are many examples that show how the society has become a lot more democratic, if you will, in the way they deal with their daily issues and struggles, even in the context of war at the moment. Then the other dynamic that I would like to highlight also, as far as the mobilization of young people in Sudan goes, is that there is a lot of literature about how African movements and mobilization by young African people and so on is mostly led by middle class urban youth. However, the case of Sudan also shows how there are a lot of more nuanced intersections between urban and rural groups, and how they together kind of mobilize together for democracy in many cases. Then there would be the cases from Nigeria and Senegal that would use the NSAS movement in Nigeria, and also the recent youth participation in democratic protests in Senegal to signify, to show the significance of the rising role of young people in influencing political dynamics in West Africa. And, although these different movements from Sudan in a very, authoritarian context to Nigeria, somewhere in the middle, and then Senegal, they're different, these are different contexts and there are specific triggers in these different countries and so on. But there's also a lot in common, particularly in terms of the rising use of digital platforms to mobilize for democracy, and also the intersection between different issues, social grievances, demands for accountability, and how that all is getting now framed in the pro-democracy kind of agenda within these groups. So the dynamics from Sudan, Nigeria, and Senegal would suggest a paradigm shift in terms of youth mobilization for democracy in Africa in particular, offering new insights into the complexities of these movements and the political change in contemporary African societies. And then we'll study the causes, dynamics, and outcomes of youth protests and mobilization for democracy in Nigeria, Senegal, and Sudan, and to kind of offer a comparative analysis of how these young individuals are shaping civic engagement and political activism across, like I said, the spectrum in terms of from a very authoritarian context in Sudan to more democratic context when looking at Senegal and Nigeria. And I think, in essence, this kind of links to where also Marioka ended. I think what we are seeing in these three countries, despite the grave challenges and so on, is that young people's mobilization for democracy in African countries, can be seen as a reason for hope for democracy in the continent and broader. Let me leave it here.
Anna, thank you very, very much. Very interesting, and we really look forward to learning more about that work. Let's move on now to Yanini. Thank you so much for joining us. I think from Brown, is that right today?
Yes, I'm at Brown today, yes.
So much on these themes, I think in the Indian context and elsewhere. So please share your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this very, very important issue and journal issue and this very enriching discussion today. I wanted to kind of approach the question of democratic erosion and also sites of democratic resilience using India as a case study. And what I thought I would focus my contribution here on would be to both try and unpack a little bit more carefully how populist, authoritarian, democratic leaders use tools of the state to seek to establish dominance and hegemony, and in that process, the tools that they're using to undermine democratic institutions. And through that investigation, also seek to identify sites of resistance, and India offers an interesting case because of the national elections that we just that were just completed in June, where at the start of the election cycle, it certainly did appear as though the BJP that was in power as a dominant party had used all forms of coercion, both legal and often not so legal, to ensure that it was on a path of total of hegemonic dominance. And as the campaign unfolded, it became evident that indeed there were sites of resistance emerging largely in the arena of mass politics, that in different ways sought to at least put a speed breaker on the project of achieving total hegemony. There are there are two core elements to the question of how dominance is sought and how democratic institutions are eroded in terms of the modes. Some are very common across democracies that are undergoing similar moments of democratic backsliding. I'm sitting in the US as it approaches an election in which one candidate seems to be so openly authoritarian that every aspect of the electoral process is being questioned in the public sphere to very little resistance. So I find the comparative quite interesting. But essentially, it is an attempt to use the powers of the state to dominate institutions by closing off all sites of contestation, political contestation, and using nationalism as a tool to enable to convert contestation into a question of being equivalent to anti-national. In India, anyone that contests the hegemonic ideals is painted very quickly as being anti-national or working against the country's economic interests. Trump in the United States is using terms like enemies of the state to most political opposition. So the use of nationalism and national identity as a framework through which to undermine contestation, to me, is an interesting tool that populists are using quite effectively across the world, and the impact that is having on undermining active political contestation, which is the first and most critical aspect of what makes for liberal democracies. The second piece that I want to look at, which is more specific to India, is on the coming together of technology and welfare to build out a technology-based a welfare architecture that has contributed that has enabled deeper political centralization and the use of and sought legitimacy through enabling the building of cult of personality of authoritarian rule. In India, increasingly now, the use of technology-based cash transfers, what we call direct benefit transfers, has become a mode through which party leaders both centralize the process of public service delivery, through that undermining sites of local contestation and local governance, which is at the heart of the democratic project, but also establishing the cult of their own personality. Our national government and Prime Minister Modi exemplifies this best and perhaps does it best, but increasingly state political, subnational political leaders and opposition leaders, even at the national level, are playing in a similar realm. And this has deep consequences on sites of local democracy, but also on dynamics of citizenship that contribute further into eroding democracy. So I want to explore these methods and mechanisms in more detail, and then pull it all together to try and look at what moments does democratic erosion also build red lines in the arena of mass politics, and how those then become sites of pushback and sites of resilience for democracy and using the election of the India election of 2024 as a site to identify those, particularly around excess, when you see authoritarian excess and the consequences of those excesses interfering in everyday rights of citizens, how at the different points at which you pushback emerges through that. So I sort of want to try and contrast both sites of erosion and sites of resistance for us to better understand the particular democratic moment that we find ourselves in.
Thank you. Very, very, very interesting. And picking up on this, your last point picks up on this theme that Chandana mentioned in the beginning, that there's actually a real debate going on out there about whether we see erosion or resilience. And your point is that they're happening simultaneously, and I think we need to keep that tension in mind. So we're going to hand over to Mick now, who warned me that that he may sound a bit pompous, and I said, no, not Mick. But rather we welcomed his grand overview and his big ideas. So Mick, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Oh, so I should rightly be blushing, actually, because
what I'm going to present you in a few minutes is like, you know, world history compressed without any advance notification. But in fact, most of the sort of big picture I'm going to present you is sort of, it's my intellectual comfort blanket to make me feel secure in what I'm saying, and what the substance I'm going to present to you is kind of more, well, moving on. Sorry, which one do we? Oh, okay, fine. Okay, let me start where John started. Go back 30 years when the previous bulletin was produced. Crudely speaking, at that point, there was a third wave of democracy in Latin America, Africa, Central and Eastern Europe. Our concerns were whether this would be consolidated, whether it would be consistent with development. At that point, we thought that electoral democracy in the West was fairly well founded, and people like John were telling us the problem was it wasn't deep enough. But we kind of thought the foundations were good. Well, 30 years later, one of the biggest single changes is we no longer think that the foundations in the West are quite so good as they were. I have been thinking about this, and much of what I'm going to say is going to be fairly obvious to you. I'm going to talk quite a lot about social media, but I decided, rather than just look at this, is it just social media or a few other things? Supposing we are in a world where the relationship between politicians and electorates, and therefore the nature of electoral competition, is actually changing quite substantially and not marginally. So let's hypothesize that there's a big change. And what would be driving this? Well, if you're my age and brought up in the kind of social science I was brought up in, you can never entirely brush from your shoulder sort of very old, long dead, gray-bearded, big picture social scientists who spoke German. And there are two in particular sitting on my shoulder in this case, the two Karls, which is Karl Marx and Karl Polanyi. So what I started hypothesizing, well, let's think, is there a real connection between what's happening in politics and what a Marxist would say is the kind of underlying structures of the economy? So, you know, is the ways in which we are getting a living changing, and is that to some degree driving changes in politics? So here I've quickly produced a typology of 6 main ways of getting a livelihood. And in fact, as I say, this is mostly intellectual comfort blanket for me, so I'm not even going to present those for now. The important ones to look at are the differences between manufacturing and the post-industrial economy. Let's not bother with this, you'll pick it up. So let's start. These are the sort of key points of the argument, or the hypothesis. One is that manufacturing, the previous phase, has been fairly consistent with social democracy. By social democracy means a fairly high level of electoral engagement, especially through interest groups of various kinds, and a government policy that pays quite a lot of attention to meeting the various needs of the electorate. A reasonable compromise between kind of capitalism and state intervention. But we're moving to something else. What is this something else? Well, there are all kinds of phrases for it. So I'm using post-industrial society. And I think maybe the key characteristics are digitalization, globalization, production mobility, where we produce things is increasingly flexible, lower workplace identification, which is a sort of summary of a whole lot of things about how people relate to the place where they work, and extended commodification. Extended commodification just means more and more things are available for sale on the market rather than being and saleable on the market.
especially in online engagements. And in particular, I'm referring to the fact that what we do online, probably including what we're doing at this minute, is actually a commodity for someone somewhere, and possibly a resaleable commodity. And this commodification of what takes place online does seem to be, this is not original point, give very strong financial incentives to amplify online engagement, by getting people more and more involved online, which involves essentially, first you've got to get them emotionally engaged, so you tap into fear, greed, resentment, and loneliness, of which there's quite a lot in the world. You don't worry about accuracy, and you focus on generating tension and conflict in some way. I happened to see there was a news item this morning that, not particularly shocking, but I didn't realize that X, former Twitter, actually pays a large number of intermediaries just to swap posts with each other in order to amplify each's record. So, I mean, this makes financial trading look quite productive by comparison. These people are doing nothing, literally, but swapping posts and allegedly earning thousands of dollars doing this. So politics and governance are prime candidates for getting implicated and involved in this kind of online engagement and manipulative marketing, we might call it. And I think for that reason, the key point is that political activity, especially the political activity of voters, ordinary people, is becoming increasingly integrated with entertainment. It's a way of keeping us occupied. Now, not new. When Ronald Reagan was first elected as president of the United States, sometime in the 1980s, I think, people said, oh, this is a significant change. California actor becomes president. But it doesn't look like that big. But the key point, and I don't think there's anything surprising to you in this, is that in this kind of environment, political engagement can easily be counterproductive and destructive and poisonous and dangerous and all those things together. And an implication of that is that I think we have to be, one implication of that, we have to be a little careful about the very common idea that political participation per se is a good thing, and the more of it there is, the better. I noticed last week our speaker, Dani Sriskandarajah, who was talking about these kind of things, made the assumption, yes, we need more political engagement, and if people are not politically engaged, it's a problem. Well, depends on quality and type. So that's fairly common. I think the thing to be really concerned about, why this might become a much bigger phenomenon, is that the main platforms that are host to this kind of activity, mainly American and a few Chinese, including TikTok, reap very high economies, both of scale and of scope. And they are therefore becoming oligopolistic or monopolistic. And well, one dimension of that is that we still think of elections, et cetera, in terms of nations, countries, dividing lines. But it seems clear to me that popular politics is becoming increasingly globalized, in the sense that, you know, what happens in Poland, you know, bleeds over in various ways to what happens in the US or India, et cetera. So I think, you know, the era when electoral politics were, on the whole, fairly strictly national is probably beginning to, if not disappear, but it's fading a little. And the final point, which is the really worrying one, is that because these platforms are quite few and monopolistic, have enormous economies of scale, they are economically and politically really powerful. And, you know, I think this is obvious to all of you. I mean, the things that Elon Musk has been engaged in the last year in particular are much worse than we thought a year ago. But it's not only Elon Musk, there are others. So the obvious answer to all this is we need, you know, the first answer to all these problems is we need better regulation of what is said and done online. The prospects for regulate, well, I hope there is good prospects for regulation. But the fact that we have these monopolies, that in various ways, those big platforms are increasingly, I think, closely integrated with centers of power, especially in Washington and Beijing, I think, to me, raises serious questions about whether we will ever get that kind of regulation. So that's the kind of very quick summary of what it's all about. The final blushing point is I'm kind of hoping that someone will tell me, actually, someone else has written all this already, and possibly I read it and forgot that I read it, and therefore I don't need to write it. So don't feel shy about telling me that this is all old hat.
Great, thanks, Mick. And of course, with this comes the assumption that these forms of each of these economies carry with them a different political economy and different forms of power, as you were saying. And similarly, as Yamini said, the forms of hegemony, the tools of domination change, but also do the tools of resistance. So Marioka and Chandana, I think just with these three, you've really got some great examples of your big points. I mean, particularly that you started on your third point, is that to understand the changing nature of democracy these days, we also have to understand the changing class, gender, racial identity politics, which are more and more polarized. There wasn't a single article on gender in the 1990 issue about democracy. All right, I'll just use this. There wasn't a single author, single article on gender, race, class dynamics in the 1990 issue, and there was of the contributors, there was one co-author who was a female. So who's writing about this and who's thinking about it is also a very, very important shift between then and now, and who IDS is working with to publish the knowledge. The second point about modes of contention and how the modes of contention have shifted from electoral and institutional to societal, I think you also hear a lot about. And those modes of contention are online, they're offline, they're through struggles, they're through violence, they're through nonviolence, but they also link to processes of resilience as well as processes of domination. And keeping that tension in mind, I think, came through all the way. So I think we've got a lot to work with. If I can just reflect for a couple of minutes on work that I've been doing in the United States around a very poor white working class community and why and how its allegiances have changed over the last 30 years. It's really interesting on all of these points. The biggest, as you know from reading the news, the biggest variable of difference in the electoral politics of the moment, very high on gender, somewhat high on race, but education is the biggest predictor, so that those without a college degree in the United States, only a high school degree, are over and away the highest supporters of Trump. And of course, when you consolidate, aggregate these and do the intersectional analysis, it's white men without a college degree who have the largest support for Trump and compare dramatically to women of color with college degrees. So why might that be? Partly, I think Mick has given us the answer. It's the white men without a college degree who have lost their workplace identity. Their manufacturing is gone. They're looking for new identities. They're joining up with other people. And what they listen to and who they listen to is very, very different from the other compositions. So I really think that the importance of information technology, not only in terms of what it does in terms of what's being produced and by whom, it's important because about information and information flows and the ability to manipulate, and add that to the tools that Yamini gave us of the ability to manipulate public opinion for certain populations in particular. We also see there that the financialization of the economy, in this case, the mines are closed, the land has been financialized, means that the locus of power has also shifted. The political economy doesn't need the workers, they don't need the local communities, they don't need the unions. And the unions were always the form of democratic participation in the backroom of the Democratic Party, so that's gone. And the local governments are no longer a real key place of resistance, Yamini, in that kind of situation. So with this changing political economy, you also have very different, I think, sites of resistance and moving away from the traditional notion that local democracy starts with local governance in order to bring about change. So I think we're seeing some very interesting trends already from these presentations. And over to you. Questions to any of the speakers, comments to each other, or from your point of view, what's different between then and now? And what are the themes you hope this bulletin will pick up on? Deepta. Can I take two or three? I'll take two or three. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a really, really great idea. My name is Deepta. I'm a research fellow here. Yamini, really lovely to see you after a very long time. Hi. So my point was picking up on what you said, John, about education and kind of linking that back to the ways in which populist leaders in democracies are actually socially engineering even at the education level. We can see that here in the UK with kind of like sets being made with children as young as 11 and determining, who's actually going to go to university or not in the first place. And in India, you see that very strongly with changing curriculum and kind of like, literally deleting histories and rewriting, textbooks with certain sort of ways and like I'm very concerned that 14 years of Modi has meant that the current youth teenagers of India have not seen anything different except that sort of kind of education. And so I'm wondering whether then whether we're headed towards, I hope not, a reduction in those sites of contestations, because that history that is held by society is actually being changed and engineered at a very sort of from a very young age.
Yeah. And the tools of socialization. Yeah. Changing dramatically. Let's just get three on this side.
That was a lot of rich material to think about. So thank you for that. I'm Erica. I am also a research fellow here at IDS. And I guess I was trying to pick up on what Chandana is offering as a crowdsourcing, mixed testing of sort of like a breakdown of a way of thinking of this, and the comment you just made, John, about what was not there in this bulletin of, 35 years ago? And so something I heard missing throughout what people were talking about, which was two things. Well, one, religion, obviously it was sort of referenced, but the role of a wide range of potential for religious movements, but then as that relates to bodies and sex and reproduction. So we were talking about modes of production, but modes of reproduction have also been such a central concern of development action and interventionism, but then kind of, obviously very much at the forefront of my mind as an American looking at what's happening with Trump is where politically that question has actually become quite central to and entangled with other questions about democracy. And that relates to my question about religion, because if we think historically, I was thinking back to sort of the moment in the 60s and the 70s and sort of the role of liberation theology, and actually openly wondering if in the work that any of you are doing, where you're looking at sort of movements within democracy, where you're seeing both sort of the regressive elements like we see in sort of some of the evangelical movements in the US and gender backlash, but where you're also seeing sort of emancipatory processes where there are new modes of communal and social organizing. But yeah, a plea not to forget bodies and embodiment in however this new bulletin is put forward.
Alex, and then let's come back for responses. Okay.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks so much. This is really exciting. I'm Alex Shanklin. I'm a fellow in the Power and Popular Politics cluster, Marioka leads. Okay, there's a lot there. I heard a lot of really fascinating and thoughtful insights into the democracy piece, what's changed since 1995. I heard less about what's changed in development since 1995. And I think it would be good to reflect on that. I was really provoked when Yamini was reflecting on the way in which the Modi era individualization of relations with the state led to a centralization, cult of personality, and so on. We had a similar phenomenon from the left with the introduction of Bolsa Familia in Brazil and the rising popularity of President Lula. So that's not a distinctively right-wing phenomenon, but it is a change in development towards a more individualized and less mediated by collective actors relation with the state, right? As John was saying, you don't need the unions, you don't need the neighborhood associations, you know. I work on access to healthcare in Brazil. That was mediated by popular movements, which were supported by labor unions, which operated through neighborhood associations and which mediated access to a collective good, a health post in your neighborhood for universal primary healthcare. We're now at a stage where actually what we think of as development problems are wicked problems. They're complex, they involve difficult trade-offs, and they require a deliberative process, which is a different kind of democracy. This is not about the excluded masses having a say in order to universalize access to a social good. This is about arguing about what is equality, what is quality in healthcare, what is a worthy object of health policy. Are women's bodies, women's fertilities a worthwhile focus of public investment? These are issues which naturally tend to lend themselves to different forms of politics. So I wanted to ask you about what you think has changed in development since 1995, crudely since before the MDGs to now late in the SDGs in the kind of global discourse, as well as the geopolitics of development and where we are with China and all the rest of it, whatever you think is relevant there to be considered in terms of how has development changed since 1995. But also in terms of what is democracy supposed to do, right? And I guess there's two key areas there for me. One is holding elites to account, right? And I think, you've spoken about accountability. Apparently, Anne-Marie is, great, fantastic to have Anne-Marie thinking about accountability, and Mick's spoken about the need for greater regulation of the Elon Musks of this world. Okay, that's about shifting power relations. We know that the origin of democracy was as an antithesis of oligarchy. We are actually living in a time of oligarchy, right? So to what extent is the developmental function of controlling predatory elites there for democracy today? And the other is the deliberative function. As I said, we're trying to solve complex problems. Where do you see signs of hope that a more deliberative approach to democracy may also be proving resilient in this adverse context? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's give the panelists a chance to comment or respond. You've got big themes there to think about: development, bodies, religion, education, and so on. But Chandana, I saw you wanted to intervene. You wanted to respond quickly to one of those. And then also I'll invite Yamini and Hamid if you want to add anything or say anything to the conversation.
I just wanted to respond very quickly to Erica, and I don't think we should sort of respond to every single one. We're taking a lot, but just pick which ones we want to speak to. But Erica, there is an article, the article on Brazil deals with exactly that. And looking at, I just wanted to read you for how they're putting this across. So from their abstract, how does Lula's administration engage with feminist and women's movements, NGOs, and academic research groups? What is the relationship with conservative movements, especially considering the Bolsonaro phenomena remains a reality in Brazilian society? And they're specifically analyzing public policies aimed at women, specifically focused on sexual and reproductive rights. So they, and another, so this is Cecilia Sardenberg and Myra Mano. And there is another article as well that is again bringing up how gender movements are affected by the transnationalization of right-wing politics in Europe. And that, Mick, I think you sit quite close to that when you talk about the fact that what you call the fact that national politics are more integrated. Manuela Caiani is calling the transnationalization of certain kinds of movements. So I think we have some really nice threads coming out around this kind of transnationalization, the effect on gender movements in particular, and women's representation, and the nature of inequality and what that means for who's being represented and how they're mobilizing.
Great, thank you. Hamid and Hamid, do you have anything you'd like to offer at this stage? Any responses or any additional comments? Yamini.
Thank you for such a rich set of comments. I wanted to just very quickly pick up on the very important provocation about what's happened to development since the mid-1990s and the broader discourse on development and how that's impacting dynamics of democracy. And I think, that's a very, very important reflection, and something that we should think a little bit harder about. But I just wanted to say that it's worth also pointing to the role of technology, and by which I mean not technology as we have discussed so far, but the technology that is the technology intervention within governance, and how the discourse around governance has moved away from where it was in the mid-1990s all the way through to the early 2000s around participatory democracy, participatory local governance, social auditing. In fact, I first met Deepta in those early days when social auditing was emerging as a very critical part of the democratic and governance discourse in India. And what technology as a tool has done to move away from this messy democracy that may slow things down, to being able to establish greater efficiency in or the claims of efficiency in dynamics of governance and development, and in turn what that is doing both to the discourse on development and to our understandings of democracy. So it's something for me to reflect on more, even in the piece that I will write for the bulletin. So thanks.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Quickly to Deepta's point, but actually partly Alex, my idea about authoritarianism is strongly informed by working in the African context, but I've also engaged a lot with the Soviet era to inform socialization and understanding there. I quite believe that any social policy, whether cash transfer or educational policy, can be abused by an autocrat that's willing to do so. But in terms of how it's passed on through generations, especially from the long-standing autocracies in like Soviet Union places, families keep transmitting on democratic stack ideas, heritage and cultures, political cultures that are democratic, even decades after suppression to that extent. So yes, it's heavily, education is the thing that the autocrat will do, change histories, change nationalist narratives. But there's always, don't forget the grounded people that are resisting that from within the household, I would say. So I'm a little bit more hopeful that it's not gonna wipe out history.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Miguel.
Thanks. Miguel Loureiro, Governance Cluster, co-convener of the MA Governance Development Public Policy, IDS most positivistic anthropologists. And I'm going to ask about measurements, because so 30 years ago, 95, the bulletin was towards democratic governance. Now, is it the tentative title, Hopes for Democratic Governance? Where's governance here? How are you measuring this? So one theme or stream is going to be the relationship between democracy and development. So there's something about development and democracy there. And I think it'd be interesting to see kind of if there's any study or any kind of using a larger data set of, especially on the development, because I started mapping out places like India, human development stalled since 2016, right? If you look at Human Development Index, right? You look at because a lot of the justification in, let's say, the recent coups in West Africa was to get rid of the French, clearly, among others. So there's that colonial thing. But also democracy wasn't working. And I think it'd be interesting to see, well, is autocracy working? Because you see, so places like Egypt, Human Development Index is increasing. Places like, I'm trying to remember, Hungary is stalled. It's kind of regressed a little bit, right? So it'd be interesting to kind of see these fluctuations of, governance indices. Mo Ibrahim has one for African countries. There's the Human Development. How are you measuring governance and development? And will you look at these trends? I think it'd be fun.
Let's go back here because I saw Steve's hand from the last round. We'll come back to the front.
Hi, I'm Steve.
Put your hand up if you want to say anything.
I'm Steve, head of communications. I'm particularly interested in this because we're planning to have quite a big focus on democracy next year, and a communications campaign looking at civil action around democracy, either to strengthen or to weaken it. So it's great to kind of hear this and see that the bulletin's taking shape. And I think I was particularly interested in technology. It's great to hear Mick talking about the role of technology, and it seems to be that you can't talk about democracy without talking about social media. I was just in a discussion earlier today where people were talking about should socially progressive organizations leave X because of their role in undermining democracy, which I think is a big question for organizations like IDS to think about. But I think AI is particularly important, and I haven't heard AI really mentioned in this discussion. And it seems to be inevitable that AI is weakening and will weaken democracy, and is a major challenge in the spread of misinformation and how it makes it so much easier for authoritarian leaders to create arguments that have no bearing in fact. And I don't know how we respond to this. I mean, just thinking about democracy and development, you could argue that AI will make certain improvements around development, around health, discovery of vaccines. But to me, it feels, and I'm a bit of an AI skeptic, that it will definitely undermine democracy. So that just feels like an important point to look at.
We could ask AI to write an article and see what happens.
Thank you very much for a really fascinating discussion. My name is Samin. I'm from the University of Birmingham, International Development Department. Let me begin by speaking for some of my colleagues who run a center on democracy and representation. They have lots of interests overlapping with you, so I hope that we can find more synergies. They're particularly interested right now in things like democratic resilience, democratic erosion, and happy to connect you all. Just to pick up on the point on education, so I work on a project on transitional justice in education. It's really fascinating to think about education, not just in the spaces of schools or discourse, but also things like museums and how people choose to memorialize various parts of their lives, either on their own or through the state. And I think that's really important because a lot of the projects that we work with are small organizations across the world and how they choose to commemorate violent events in those countries' pasts particularly, and how they find ways to do it that are quite subversive. So whether it is a mobile museum that is traveling in rural areas or it's online. So the work we do in Pakistan, it's primarily through animated films online. For me, the thing that was surprising was that the things you can get away with saying online because the ability of the state to regulate it is less. There's also a very interesting book coming out, I think next month, called Raise to Obey, which actually looks at education as something that states have adopted in general as a means of social control. So, it's not just India or places that are backsliding, but the history of education is like that. I think it's with Princeton, but I don't remember the name of the author. My own work speaks a lot to Yamini's work, and we've been in other spaces recently as well, where we've talked about parallels between Pakistan and India. And when people speak about India right now, immediately I'm thinking through Pakistan's history. But a lot of my work considers sort of citizen-state interactions in Pakistan and how Pakistan is by no means and has not been for a very long time a democracy. But I think it's really interesting to think about how Pakistan's hybridity or its hybrid regime actually embeds practices in the state that undermine democracy over the long term. So my work, for instance, thinks about how those practices get embedded in the state, in the bureaucracy itself. So how you can't break free of it because the state itself is sort of embodying a hybrid form where it's, there's some practices that might be superficially democratic because you are aspirationally democratic, but you're also very, very autocratic in your practices. And I found it particularly useful to look at the work of Marlies Glaciers, who talks about autocracy in practice, and really useful to think through how those things become embedded in institutions that you can't really change by elections or formal process, or even sometimes informal processes, because you don't have that kind of access. So yeah, really looking forward to the issue. Thank you.
Jump over here now.
Thank you. Hi there. My name's Dan Paget. I'm from the Politics Across Campus. So the provocation from the chair, one of the provocations was about what's different between now and the last bulletin, and going alongside with that, what should be in this issue. And I found myself thinking that, I guess, running across those third and fourth themes that Chandana and Marioka, you spoke about, or perhaps a context that frames them all, which is obvious, but I think important. And I wonder whether you'd see a role for it in the framing of the bulletin. Is that 1995, of course, was a moment in which a post Soviet versus capitalist liberal world order was in formation and seemed secure. Now we're in a global moment in which a different sort of, in which a liberal order is fracturing and under threat, and the threats are not individual; they're connected, and they see each other as connected. So there's something to be said there for recognizing the different global context in which all of these different struggles and over democracy and development are taking place. And I guess seeing at the same time that those struggles are ideological, not only in the challenges to democratization, not only in the autocratizing movements, but in the changing conceptions of what it is being defended when democracy is being defended, and what future is being imagined for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Anu Joshi, also a fellow here in IDS, and hi, Yamini. Good to see you online. So I wanted to actually pick up and try and see if you would expand a little bit in the bulletin, this idea of linking what Mick is calling the modes of production to democracy, because it seems to me that, yes, technology is one part of it, and technology has shifted a lot of things, but also the nature of work is changing. And the changing nature of work has had a double whammy, in my view. One is obviously the kinds of impacts on possibilities for democracy, deepening, working, etc., that Mick outlined. But also, I think economically it has an impact. So precarity, lack of employment, lack of security, all those things that came, what we expect and what's expected of work is changing. And that, I think, is a very strong link to both development as well as democracy. So if we can deepen a little bit that theme, it would be great.
I think maybe we should go for a double issue. Getting more and more. Thanks for this. Let's come back to get any further points and reactions. But Hamid, I just wondered if I could ask you to contribute a little bit more here. Anything you want to pick up on, but I was particularly interested in your comparative work across youth in Nigeria, Senegal, and Sudan. Do you see key differences in the kinds of youth that are mobilized across those countries? Or what does that comparative work tell us about? Because we tend to homogenize youth, right? So it's, what else, how can we refine that concept and politically?
Yeah, thank you. I think I would also like to quickly add to the discussion earlier around religion and how it plays a role. And I think this is not necessarily going to feature in the paper, but from other work that I do, I think to see, what changed and what's happening and developing vis-a-vis, religion and democracy in particular. Recently, I think looking at the quote unquote Arab Spring and also Sudan, there's a lot of interesting insights and things to understand in terms of seeing how religious group can play a role, regardless of how that role is as part of the pro-democracy mobilization movement and so on. So seeing how, for instance, in Egypt, the tension between religious and secular groups within the same pro-democracy, movement, if you will, kind of made secular groups support a military coup that essentially ended the democratic transition in the country, and how these tensions also in Tunis, for instance, have laid the grounds for the constitutional amendments that took place a couple of years ago to strengthen, or to kind of impact the democracy of the country and strengthen the authoritarianism of the president. And we also see similar features in Sudan. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. In terms of the comparison between the youth across Sudan, Nigeria, and Senegal, I think this, it would come hopefully a lot more stronger in the paper, because I'm working more on the Sudan part, and my colleague always working more on the Senegal and Nigeria part. But I think they're not the same, definitely. I think and from a very quick kind of analysis, I think what I will be offering from the Sudan side is that because of the way the mobilization took place in Sudan and so on, it kind of broke these class dynamics to some extent, where there was a lot of engagement from youth across different classes, youth in different platforms, and so on. Meanwhile, you wouldn't see the same, I think, particularly maybe in Senegal, where there's a bit more urban middle class elements to that. Potentially in Nigeria, because the whole movement was in response to the police brutality, the NSAS, and police brutality is usually geared towards a specific class and type of youth and so on. So there would be more engagement to that. So I think definitely no, they're not the same, and they're different. And I think part of the comparative analysis that we're going to work on is to kind of highlight these differences between the type of youth who engage in different movements and what causes these differences.
Great, thank you. Mick, I wanted to see if you had any further reflections, having heard this, about amending your modes of production theory, particularly whether the modes of production links to the question over here about how do the changing modes of production play out in different geopolitical terms. And then we'll ask Chandana and Miroke to share back some of the key insights they've gotten, and then we'll close. Thank you.
I think this works, does it? Or perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps I'll have to. Okay. Actually, I wanted to comment on a couple of things. Erica has left. She said we hadn't mentioned bodies or religion. No problem in getting people in IDS to talk about bodies, but religion is interesting. We're quite a weird place. I mean, if you look at the Pew whatever research, if you ask people worldwide how important religion is in your life, it is quite important, and generally speaking, the poorer the country, the more important religion is, with the US as a partial exception there. But if you come to IDS, we're such a secular place. I mean, I think we're completely out of touch with the world, possibly. What the implication of that for democracy, I don't know, but it does strike me. One other thing I want to say briefly, Alex, about the development, bringing the development in. When this last bulletin was written, there was a very big debate on democracy and development conducted mainly by cross-country statistical analysis. And it was completely reached an impasse, didn't tell us anything. But at least you could have that debate, because at that point, we defined development pretty much as GDP per head, or GDP per head plus something about distribution, something about human development. And we thought of development as a thing produced mainly by governments and government policy. So, you could produce models, democratic governments do this kind of thing to the economy that does or doesn't produce a result. The problem is that that second assumption that GDP per head is dominantly produced by governments was always very questionable. And in this global world, it is even less true than it ever was. If you look at the countries that had the highest rate of GDP growth last year, they're a very random group of countries, and it depends mainly on international prices for something going up or going down. So there's a problem. There's also a problem on the other side, is that we don't any longer even have a core of agreement about what development is. I mean, some of us actually think climate change is, so much more important than everything else, and, etc. So I'm not saying we shouldn't tackle it, but my point is it's a really difficult kind of issue to grapple with. Actually, I'm going to pass on modes of production, John, if you don't mind.
Thanks for all the great suggestions, comments, questions. I think I'll agree with John that we may need various issues on all the possible angles that we can take. On AI, it's interesting. It's one of the most obvious big changes in social media as well, and AI in what's part of our everyday life and politics today. We don't have a central article on this in the bulletin. There are I think Manuela Cayani will be working on Europe, and transnationalism will be like integrated into where it's used in the anti-democratic way. Hamid and Olewole will be using it in the contestation piece. So it's sort of integrated into, and I suspect in other articles as well, just like it is integrated in our everyday lives now rather than a standalone. We also don't have an article on the indicators, right? And this is probably one of the paragraphs that we were considering, do we include or not include it in the introduction? Or whether whether we're going to address that so standardly. But I think again that some of the articles will integrate some of those stats basically. Shall I go?
I think this is the really big question for us now. So thank you so much. This has been really useful and we've got loads of notes. What comes out of this, for me at least, is this really big question that we have before us now, which is whether we're dealing here, what the central focus of this bulletin then is, whether we're dealing with what the outcomes of democracy are and what it helps do, or are we talking about how people engage with democracy and make sense of that? And a lot of your comments have spoken to those centrally. So Alex's earlier question, Miguel's question, who's been pushing for this paper that he and I are working on to be thought about as part of this, which is the trends of the patterns of authoritarianism, autocratization. Where the outcomes of democracy, I think, maybe sit outside this journal, this issue, is the way I think of it, because a lot of the, but I mean, lots of comments have spoken to that. The way I think about it is, sorry, including Samin's comments, autocracy in practice, democracy in practice, this is all really great stuff, but it's all about what happens as a result of all of this. And I'm wondering to what extent we're going there, as opposed to a lot of your other comments, which were about engagement or meaning making, and how people now engage with online spaces, or how new technologies mean that people make sense of what's happening with democracy, how people relate to it. And Anu, yours, which sits, I think, centrally in what we are doing, which is that third point around what the changing nature of engagement is because of the changing nature of income and the economy, and therefore class, and where you sit in everything, and how you therefore use that where you're situated to make sense of what you see as this thing that we're calling democracy. So in that sense, my sense so far is that we're on that engagement side of how people see it, and how they contest it, and how they make sense of parties, of all of these other things. But what I'm taking away from this is how much interest there is in thinking about the outcomes that result from all of this, and see maybe if the other articles speak more to it, then we take that up a little bit, or we think about a follow-up that does the other side of this. And fantastic to see you here, Dan, because I know you've been working on this, thinking about this. So really good to make the connection with Sussex as well on this. Yeah.
Great. And actually another theme that's very much in the previous issue, and we haven't talked about here today, is the relationship between aid and democracy and democratic development, and what are the modes of aid that would support democracy. And I think Tom Carruthers is suggesting he reflect on that a little bit, but it's something which we don't see as so important in today's conversation. Well, listen, thanks very much, everyone, for coming. You've given us a great idea in terms of the bulletin. I think usually when the bulletin is produced, we do a launch seminar, but actually having a seminar early on to feed into the bulletin, I think has been very rich and productive, and we should try it again for future bulletins as well. So thank you for coming. Thanks so much to our panelists, and particularly Yamini and Hamid. Thank you for joining us online, and you came through loud and clear, so much appreciated.